what's up everyone? Welcome to Asylums Uncovered, where we discuss the influence and impact of state hospitals on American history and the void left in their absence. Nestled in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York is the small town of Dannemora, and as you travel along Route 374, the town's main thoroughfare, the imposing 30-foot high walls of the Clinton Correctional Facility soon come into view. This massive complex outfitted with watchful guard towers might seem intimidating to outsiders, but for the people of Dannemora, the prison is woven into the fabric of everyday life. It's a major employer in the area, and if you don't work there yourself, chances are you know someone who does. My fiance's late father was a sergeant at Clinton, which makes this episode especially meaningful to me, but today I'm not here to focus solely on the prison, but another institution that sits on these very grounds. A place I was fortunate enough to tour recently as one of the first people from the public to see the inside since its closure in 2021. I am talking about the former Dannemora State Hospital for Insane Convicts. Guys, I am so excited for this episode. So as I mentioned, I recently was able to tour the former Dannemora State Hospital. It is not open to the public, and after it closed in 2021, it is pretty much just sat. Beds are still in the cells, the dorm-style areas are still outfitted with furniture, employee names are on the walls, and inmate artwork still decorates the hallways. I got to see everywhere from the old surgical suites to the chapel to the old movie projection room, and I really don't see this place talked about much, so I am thrilled to be able to share the history and my experience there. But before I dive into any of that, we have to talk about the history of the prison because it really did impact the state hospital. Dannemora is a remote town tucked near the Canadian border with a population of about 3,000 people. It has beautiful parks, lakes, friendly locals, and one imposing structure you cannot ignore: the Clinton Correctional Facility. Established in 1845, Clinton is an all-male maximum security facility and remains one of the oldest and largest prisons in the state of New York. It's notorious for housing some of the state's most dangerous criminals, its violent history, and tough conditions. Winters here are long and harsh, which earned the prison the nickname of Little Siberia. You weren't sent to Clinton for petty crimes. It was a place reserved for some of the worst and repeat offenders. Finding inmate and staff population depends on the year and where you look. The Village of Dannemora website states that the prison holds about 2,000 inmates and has around 1,000 employees. According to the data from the Correctional Association of New York, the inmate population dropped significantly from nearly 3,000 in 2010 to around 1,300 by 2024. And as of February last year, Clinton was operating at just 68% capacity with over 600 beds sitting empty. When the prison opened, inmates were laborers who worked in the nearby iron mines. But around the turn of the 20th century, the facility adopted the state use system, where inmates began manufacturing goods for local and state governments. Prisons across New York produced a wide range of items under the program, including furniture, license plates, textiles, and more. At Clinton specifically, inmates who worked in the tailor shop made correction officer uniforms and inmate clothing. And if you're thinking, man, Clinton sounds really familiar, well, you might be right. It's housed some well-known inmates over the years, ranging from rapper Tupac Shakur to infamous serial killers Joel Rifkin and David Berkowitz, better known as the Son of Sam. Or maybe you remember the 2015 prison escape that made national headlines when convicted murderers Richard Matt and David Sweat pulled off a daring and elaborate plan. Over the course of 3 months, they secretly chiseled their way from their cells through the walls and tunnels of the prison's subterranean levels, eventually emerging through a manhole cover just 1 block outside the prison's perimeter. It was the first successful escape from the prison in over a century. And I have been to that exact street where that manhole cover is, and it's pretty surreal to turn around and see the massive prison wall right in front of you. The fact that they were able to accomplish a feat like that is pretty wild. I mean, they got through multiple layers of brick walls, all while going undetected. But they didn't do it alone. So 2 prison employees, tailor shop supervisor Joyce Mitchell and corrections officer Gene Palmer, were arrested for aiding in the escape. After being on the run for about 3 weeks and every law enforcement agency you can imagine looking for them, Matt was shot and killed by a BORTAC agent, and Sweat was eventually captured and placed back into state custody. The Inspector General's investigation report about the escape is is public, and I will link that in the notes if you'd like to read it. It has all of the details about the escape and is actually really fascinating. So as you can see, Clinton has a very colorful history. Today, the prison still operates as an all-male maximum security facility. A lot of reform has happened, and as a result, more resources are available to the inmates. Clinton offers many programs to include alcohol and substance abuse treatment, academic and vocational training, counseling services, and more. These programs are aimed at improving the chances of a successful reintegration back into society should they ever be released. Now that you have a fundamental understanding of the prison, let's talk about the massive building right next door. In 1899, the Dannemora State Hospital for Insane Convicts was established to care for inmates from across New York State who were declared insane during their incarceration. This wasn't uncommon. There have always been facilities that have cared for the criminally insane. Today, you'll usually see it called a forensics building or a forensics unit at a state hospital. But the difference here is that today, these places usually serve those found not guilty by reason of insanity, whereas those going to Dannemora were already found guilty and became insane while serving their sentence. When the hospital first opened, it was not an official part of Clinton Correctional, although it was in such close proximity. The facility was built by prison staff and inmates and was outside of those massive walls that you see surrounding the main prison. And if you look at an aerial view, you'll see Clinton behind the wall and then the state hospital directly beside it. The architecture is absolutely stunning. It is beautiful Richardsonian Romanesque with its large rounded archways, and it almost looks like half a Kirkbride. And what I mean by that is it's got a main administration section, but then has a couple wings that shoot out to the left in echelon. And you may have heard me talk about Richardsonian Romanesque in prior episodes. The best example of this is the Buffalo State Hospital. And I have looked and looked for an exact square footage number on the hospital, and I cannot find one for the life of me. So if you happen to have that information, please send it to me because I am so curious. I have read through annual reports beginning in 1905 and have not been able to find an exact number. In 1900, the first patients to arrive at Dannemora were male felons transferred from Mattawan State Hospital with at least 6 months remaining on their sentences. The hospital took in patients from penitentiaries, reformatories, and prisons from all over the state. If you were a male who was declared insane while serving your sentence, you were going to Dannemora. And for many, that was likely really unsettling given the hospital's location right next to Clinton and its dangerous reputation. And not all patients were originally from New York State. Many were from other countries to include Austria, Italy, Norway, and more. Some reasons for admission included mania, paranoia, imbecility, epilepsy, and the number one reason, dementia praecox, which is now known as schizophrenia. So a lot of parallels here between Dannemora and other regular state hospitals, with reasons for admission being epilepsy, imbecility, things like that. And yes, there were some people who even faked insanity to get admitted. This didn't happen often, but I guess people thought maybe it would be a better sentence to serve out in a state hospital versus a prison. If a patient was deemed recovered but still had time remaining on their sentence, they were returned to prison to serve out the rest of their term like any other inmate. If their sentence had ended and they were considered recovered, they were released and allowed to return home. However, if they were still struggling with a mental illness, they were transferred to a regular state hospital for continued care. And when you look at the annual reports from the first 20 to 30 years that the hospital was open, you'll notice a couple of trends. One being, out of all of the discharges, recovered status seemed to have the highest numbers, which seems fantastic for the hospital because this reflects that treatments were working and those patients were no longer suffering from a mental illness. The deaths you see on the discharge reports in the early years are mainly caused from things that really impact breathing or the lungs, like tuberculosis, influenza, or pneumonia. In fact, TB was such an issue that the hospital constructed a separate ward specifically for those patients. The thinking was that the cool, fresh air from the Adirondacks would be beneficial to help cure the disease. And this was really common at the time. You would see a lot of sanatoriums built in quiet, rural locations, thinking relaxation and the clean air would aid in recovery. Although the TB vaccine was first developed in 1921, it took many years for public acceptance and to go mainstream. Within 5 years of opening, there were already reports of overcrowding. There were both single-cell rooms and dormitory-style setups, and it was reported that those areas were at max capacity and the patients were sleeping in hallways, day rooms, and in the basement, which is not ideal, but very common for state hospitals at the time. Conditions became unsanitary and unsafe from the increasing population. Some of these individuals were very dangerous and mentally disturbed, and when you put them in an environment that's chaotic with overcrowding, it could be a recipe for disaster. It was recommended that these patients be put in the single-cell rooms to lessen the chance of them hurting or killing themselves or someone else. In fact, in 1917, Dr. Charles North, who had served as superintendent for 13 years, was tragically killed by an inmate. After finishing a conversation with the patient, Dr. North turned to walk away when he was fatally stabbed in the back with a chisel. He was only 49 years old. The inmate had been transferred from Sing Sing prison and apparently gave no explanation for why he did what he did. This really shows the type of patients that were there and how dangerous the environment was. Throughout the years, the hospital expanded, adding on new wards, even bringing in new technology to help expedite processes like laundry, iron, and woodworking. Very similar to the Kirkbride plan where patients would work on the hospital grounds, those at Dannemora worked in the chicken coop and on the farm. They also worked in the tailor shop, the sewing room, and the shoe shop, making goods like mattresses, sheets, and clothing for the facility. And this was usually done for a couple of reasons. One, to save money. You're basically getting free labor from the inmates. And two, it gave the patients a sense of purpose. Now, obviously, not every patient had these privileges, just the ones deemed safe and trustworthy enough. Also very similar to the Kirkbride plan, attending physicians lived in the main administration section of the hospital since they were legally required to reside on the grounds. And over time, additional staff housing was built along with a separate residence for the superintendent. Now, going back to those annual reports that I mentioned, another trend we see year after year is how the census just grew and grew and grew. There were a couple exceptions to this. So first was when the hospital had to halt admissions due to the overcrowding and understaffing. And secondly was around both world wars, while men were either voluntarily going into the service or being drafted. In the earlier years, finding quality staff and retaining them was very difficult. The biggest issue that Dannemora faced was the low pay, especially compared to working next door at the prison. The argument was that the layer of insanity on top of an already demented or dangerous individual made the stakes that much higher. Someone working in this environment needed to not only have the correct skills as an attendant, but also great judgment and great self-control. And honestly, I agree with the higher pay because if I was in that position, I would probably want more money too. Eventually, the hospital became kind of a training ground for men to go and get hired, only to get the experience, quit, and then go work at the prison for more money. We start seeing women employed at the hospital in the early 1920s, but up to this point, there were no female nurses or attendants. Also around this time, we see a dentist on staff, and before that, dental care just really wasn't a priority, and at one point, an inmate at Clinton was a dentist, and they actually brought him over to perform services on other inmates. So again, it kind of goes back to that whole free labor thing that I mentioned earlier. But not everything was always work. Like many other state hospitals, entertainment for the patients was a priority through music, movies, sports teams, and holiday parties. The name was officially changed to just Dannemora State Hospital in 1912 and operated as such for the next 60 years. In 1972, the facility closed as a state hospital and the remaining patients were transferred downstate to Matawan State Hospital. Dannemora became known as the Adirondack Correctional Treatment and Evaluation Center, and for the next 3 years functioned as a behavioral unit providing therapies to inmates. The building and grounds were officially annexed to Clinton Correctional in 1975, and the former state hospital became known as the Clinton Annex. It continued to provide treatment to inmates just as its predecessors did. It's important to note that the annex was a medium security facility while the main prison remained maximum security. The inmates housed at the annex typically were not deemed high risk. A lot of them were older, maybe had been in prison for a while, and just didn't really cause any issues. The Merle Cooper program, established in 1977, was designed to support inmates struggling to adjust to life behind bars. Its goal was to help participants participants adapt to the prison environment while also preparing them for reintegration back into society. Through a combination of group counseling and hands-on work in the prison's furniture shop, the program aimed to build coping skills, discipline, and a sense of purpose. This program excluded high-security inmates, those serving life sentences, and anyone declared criminally insane. It did, however, include a number of individuals convicted of sex offenses. And understandably, this may raise some strong opinions, but my goal here is just to simply present the facts. The annex officially closed its doors in 2021, ending 121 years of service to the state of New York. The decision, ordered by Governor Cuomo, sparked backlash from many who felt the facility provided valuable resources and support to inmates. Beyond that, in a small town like Dannemora, the loss or relocation of roughly 300 staff positions was a significant blow to the local economy. At the time of its shutdown, the annex was capable of housing 840 inmates. This building has so much history, and I was so honored to be able to walk the halls of this former institution. Unfortunately, I was not able to take in my phone or a camera inside, so I don't have any photos of anything, but it was still really, really special to see nonetheless. My first takeaway was how massive the annex is. And you really don't realize the magnitude of it just looking at it from the outside. But as we were walking through the different areas, I was just like, wow, this place just keeps going and going and going. Inside, each area is identified by a building. So it's building 1, building 2, and it's a little confusing at first because you're only in one building. But if you think of it more in terms of a ward, it makes much more sense. And I had so many favorite parts, but I want to tell you guys about all of them. First is the bowling alley in the basement. So it's just 2 lanes, but when it was functioning, it would automatically reset the pens, and it did have a ball return, and inmates could go there and spend time with their families and, have a nice little afternoon. Next up were the surgical suites, obviously. So the old giant operating light was still up. The area where the surgeons would scrub in was still there, but there was no operating table still left, which was kind of a bummer, which kind of leads me to the old morgue. It's pretty tucked away in the basement, and at first glance, it just kind of looks like an old storage room. You could probably pass by it, not really think much of it. But when you really start to look, then you'll notice the drain on the floor. There is no cooler, there's no tables, anything left in that area like that. When the new hospital building was open for the prison, which is a totally separate building behind the prison wall, obviously everything went over there. The gymnasium in here is absolutely massive. It almost looks like a YMCA where you forget that you're in a prison facility. Also in the gym, they would play movies on the wall, which leads me to the old projection room in the attic. There's 2 or 3 old projectors up there with the old films, and we were trying to look at the film tape and see what movies they were, but we weren't able to figure it out. We did see the area in the basement where Dr. North was murdered. There's not much in that area. I think there were some old refrigerators, things like that. They were just mostly used for storage. You would not know that someone was murdered there unless it was pointed out to you. Also in the basement is where some of the older cells were. It's very dark, dreary, dingy, pretty depressing if you were housed down there. But now a ton of piping and plumbing and things like that all run through the old cells. And I can't even begin to tell you how many miles of pipe is in that building. It is absolutely insane. Actually, one of my favorite things that we saw in the old visitation room was some incredible artwork painted on the walls. Just absolutely beautiful, beautiful scenery of nature and wildlife, all painted by, I cannot remember the inmate's name for the life of me. We were thinking maybe it was Harris. I'm kicking myself because I cannot remember the name, but it was signed by them and dated in 1994. So if this rings a bell for you, or if this was you, please let me know, because your artwork was absolutely beautiful in there. The dining hall could hold about 400 inmates. There was also lots of artwork on the walls there as well. And in the area where the employees would be, where the warden would be, there was a wall with employee names on it, and each had a tab that flipped back and forth, and one side was green and one side was red, so you would know if they were working or not. And lastly, one of the absolute coolest things I've seen in any institution I've ever been to was the rotating backdrop in the chapel. The chapel has these faux stained glass windows with some kind of lighting behind it, so it actually looks like it's the outside. But the backdrop to the stage was incredible. The best way I can describe it to you, you would slide it back and forth, and there was a handful of different backdrops for whichever religion was having the service. But the talent of the woodwork, it almost made me think this was some kind of prison woodworking project, and someone just incredibly talented carved all of this and made these beautiful ornate backdrops. But I've never seen anything like that before that slides back and forth so you can change the background. I don't know what the future holds for the annex. It's sat empty for about 4 years now. I feel very honored and very blessed to be able to see it, so I do hope that it's put to good use. All right, everyone, that is it for me today. Thank you for listening, and until next time.